It was late August 1942, a dark and pivotal moment in human history when the world seemed to be drowning slowly under the expanding shadow of the rising sun. On the storm-lashed, pitch-black night of the 30th, the Imperial Japanese forces launched their most desperate and high-stakes gamble yet, a final, bloody assault against Airstrip Number 3 at Milne Bay. The environment itself was a nightmare made manifest. Suffocating tropical downpours turned the earth into a liquid trap, and the waist-deep, sucking black mud became a physical weight on every man who tried to move through it. Standing in the path of the Emperor's elite naval units were the resilient men of the 25th and 61st Battalions of the Australian 7th Infantry Brigade. At this critical juncture, these men were mere militia, often cruelly and unfairly dismissed by the high-ranking military elites as chocolate soldiers who would supposedly melt under the intense heat of real combat. They had received only the most rudimentary training and possessed virtually zero actual battlefield experience before being thrust into this green hell. Their primary adversary, Commander Shojiro Hayashi, led a force of elite naval paratroopers and special landing forces. Riding the terrifying wave of what then seemed like an unstoppable Japanese tide sweeping across the South Pacific, Hayashi led from the front, fully expecting a swift and crushing victory over a foe he considered vastly inferior. However, on that treacherous and lethal night, Hayashi and his battle-hardened troops were met with a psychological and physical shock that shattered their absolute confidence. The raw, unyielding ferocity of the Australian defenders. Having never encountered this brand of stubborn, back-to-the-wall resistance, these supposedly green Australian units adapted with lightning speed to the horrific realities of jungle warfare. They improvised genius, yet straightforward tactics that did far more than just slaughter the Japanese forces at Milne Bay. They acted as the vital, historic catalyst that finally caused the tide of global conflict to turn against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific War. This is the definitive saga of how Australian militia units, men who were never expected to hold the front line by their own generals, carved their names into the annals of military history by standing their ground against the legendary might of the Imperial Japanese forces. This is a story of courage, mud, and fire. In the 8 long and agonizing months following the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military machine had appeared to the world as an invincible, supernatural force of nature. Without the United States Pacific Fleet to act as a substantial counterweight to their territorial hunger, they pushed forward with a savage and relentless campaign that saw them seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia in record-breaking time. By March of that year, Japan had already secured the territory of New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies. Their strategic focus was now aimed directly at the Australian-controlled territory of Papua. Japan had officially arrived on the very doorstep of the Australian continent, and the threat of invasion was no longer a theory, but a looming reality that terrified the local population. With Australia now finding itself on the razor's edge of the Pacific conflict, and with their own supply lines stretched to the absolute breaking point, Japan's primary strategic goal was to lock down their southern flank once and for all. They intended to establish a zone of absolute naval and aerial control to isolate the entire region and dominate its strategic waters. One of the most vital locations in this grand imperial strategy was Port Moresby, the capital of Papua, situated on the vulnerable southern coast. Capturing Port Moresby would have allowed the Japanese to construct a massive, sophisticated airbase, giving them the ultimate power to control the Pacific Islands, completely sever Australia's communications with its global allies in the West, and launch terrifying daily air raids on major Australian cities like Townsville and beyond. It was also intended to be the primary staging point for any future large-scale invasion of the Australian mainland itself. However, the geopolitical chessboard shifted significantly in May 1942. After the Japanese naval fleet sustained critical, unexpected damage during the Battle of the Coral Sea, A massive amphibious assault on Port Moresby was no longer a viable option for their admirals. Japan was forced to pivot their entire strategy to a grueling, soul-crushing land-based assault across the nightmare terrain of the Owen Stanley Range via the infamous and deadly Kokoda Track. Because of this nearly impossible landscape, the Japanese ground forces were restricted to carrying only what they could physically shoulder through the mountains. This created a desperate need for a secondary supply route. Therefore, it was a matter of extreme strategic necessity that the Japanese Navy meet their land forces in Port Moresby with fresh supplies, heavy reinforcements, and the massive heavy equipment required to transform the area into an impenetrable fortress. The most direct sea route to Port Moresby lay through the narrow and treacherous China Strait, a passage so dangerous for warships that it required constant local air protection to be viable against Allied bombers. Japan identified Milne Bay, located on the southeasternmost tip of Papua, along with the tiny islands scattered off its coast, as the most suitable location for a new seaplane base that would provide this essential life-saving air cover for their fleet as they moved through these restricted waters. But unbeknownst to the Japanese High Command, the Allied forces had already grasped the immense strategic value of Milne Bay and had been feverishly active in the region since the month of June. General Douglas MacArthur, the recently appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, had instructed his senior officers to pinpoint 2 specific locations for new bases that could shield Port Moresby's vulnerable flanks. Merauke was chosen to protect the western flank, while Milne Bay was designated to guard the east. In June 1942, the 46th United States Engineer Battalion was dispatched to the humid shores of Milne Bay with urgent orders to establish 3 critical airstrips in the middle of the wilderness. The 55th Australian Infantry Battalion, a militia unit, was also sent to provide a screen of protection for the engineers as they worked. The labor was grueling beyond any human description as the men hacked through lightless, dense jungle and sodden, rotting coconut plantations. With almost no direct sunshine reaching the forest floor, heavy daily rainfall, and trails that turned into bottomless, black, muddy bogs, the living conditions were utterly horrendous and demoralizing. A vast number of the early troops were struck down by malaria, blackwater fever, and other debilitating tropical diseases that thinned their ranks daily. The 55th Battalion was so severely affected by widespread illness that in early August, they had to be completely withdrawn and sent back to Port Moresby just to survive. By the 11th of July, the 7th Brigade arrived under the command of Brigadier John Field. This was a militia force made up of the 9th, 25th, and 61st Royal Queensland Infantry Battalions. Because the deadline for the completion of the airstrips was so incredibly tight, these soldiers were immediately put to back-breaking manual labor on construction rather than being allowed to prepare their defensive positions or undergo the specialized training drills necessary for fighting in the thick jungle. They were fighting the terrain as much as they were preparing for the enemy. Despite these life-threatening conditions and the utter exhaustion of the men, the work moved forward through sheer force of will, and by the 21st of July, the American engineers and their Australian support units managed to complete the very first airstrip. Over the course of the next few days, the 75th and 76th Squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force, equipped with their rugged P-40 Kitty Hawks, arrived on site. On the 4th of August, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted the Australian garrison at Milne Bay, which came as a total shock to their intelligence officers in Rabaul. They reported back to their base seeing planes on the ground, but they critically underestimated the strength of the defense, reporting a garrison of only a few hundred men. They assumed the Australians would run at the first sight of a bayonet charge. Based on this catastrophic and arrogant intelligence error, the Japanese Navy issued final orders for an invasion on the night of the 25th to the 26th for the total capture of the bay. However, the Japanese had made a fatal and historic blunder in their planning. When the night of the 25th arrived, the Australians did not have a few hundred men. They had a massive hidden garrison of approximately 9,000 soldiers defending the 3 strips. In addition to the 7th Brigade and the Kitty Hawks, the 18th Brigade of the Australian Imperial Force had arrived by mid-August under the command of Brigadier George Vasey. This unit, which had recently returned from the brutal, dust-blown campaigns of North Africa and the Mediterranean, was composed of the veteran 2nd 9th, 2nd 10th, and 2nd 12th Battalions. Furthermore, the 43rd United States Engineer Regiment had also been sent to help, bringing the total number of defenders to nearly 9,000 under the overall command of Major General Cyril Close. Aware that a massive attack was imminent, Close organized his lines with the less experienced 7th Brigade, the militia, in the forward positions to take the initial brutal brunt of the assault. He held the veteran 18th Brigade in the rear as a powerful elite counterattack force to be used when the enemy was exhausted. The Japanese landing force consisted of 3 elite naval infantry companies, 2 light tanks, and a dedicated landing craft company. They planned a 2-front attack under Shojiro Hayashi, with 1,300 men landing at Rabi and a second unit of 350 men, known as the Tsukioka Force, landing at Taupota for an overland assault on the northern flank. But fate intervened in a dramatic fashion. On the 24th, the Taupota force was spotted by the Royal Australian Navy, and the very next day, 9 Kitty Hawks descended like vengeful spirits, attacking them with machine guns and bombs, destroying every single one of their landing craft and leaving the entire force stranded and useless on a distant island. This effectively cut the Japanese strength by 20% before the main battle even began. On the night of the 25th, Hayashi, completely unaware that his northern support had been annihilated, proceeded with the landing in Milne Bay. Due to the blinding vertical tropical rain and the thick mist, his men landed 10 kilometers short of their intended objective. As they struggled through the mud toward Rabi, they collided head-on with B Company of the 61st Battalion. A fierce, terrifying, close-quarters struggle broke out in the dark. While the Australians were eventually forced to yield some ground, the supposedly amateur militia held off the elite Imperial attackers for the entirety of that first crucial night. Hayashi was forced to send a hesitant report back to Rabaul, apologizing to his superiors for his failure to take the strip. This forced the Japanese to halt their unloading operations at dawn, but the window of opportunity had closed forever. Allied bombers and Kitty Hawks swarmed the bay like hornets, flying 60 sorties that day and sinking every single one of the 12 Japanese landing craft. This was a death blow to Japanese logistics, leaving their elite troops with no way to receive heavy weapons, extra ammunition, or food. Despite the devastating loss of his transport ships, Hayashi continued his desperate offensive, but was met with a literal wall of determination from the men of the 61st Battalion. By the morning of the 27th, the 61st was down to only 82 men fit for combat. The 2nd 10th Battalion was sent forward to relieve them, but these veterans, fresh from the deserts of Africa, underestimated the jungle and ignored the hard-won advice of the militia units, even going so far as to leave their heavy anti-tank guns behind. That night, Hayashi's light tanks smashed through their lines, and the 2nd 10th was scattered and broken in the pitch-black chaos. The Japanese then hit the 25th Battalion, but here their luck finally ran out in the mud. Both Japanese light tanks slid off the narrow, slippery trail into deep, water-filled ditches, their tracks spinning uselessly in the air. The militia units once again proved their incredible and underestimated valor, holding the line with grim tenacity until the arrival of daylight forced the Japanese to retreat back into the thick jungle to hide from the inevitable air attacks. The Japanese then brought in 600 fresh reinforcements under the command of Minoru Yano and prepared for one last massive assault on airstrip number 3. General Close set up a massive layered defense with the 25th and 61st Battalions. The strip itself was a 2-kilometer-long killing field with perfectly clear lines of sight, reinforced with miles of barbed wire and heavy Vickers machine guns. Supporting them were American engineers on half-tracks, armed with devastating 50-caliber machine guns that could shred jungle cover. On the night of the 30th, the Japanese made their final move. The rain was torrential, washing away the world. Hayashi lost nearly half of his new troops to the confusing jungle terrain before they even reached the edge of the strip. He led 3 desperate, screaming charges across the open ground, but each time the Australians met them with a synchronized and devastating barrage of lead and high explosives. Hayashi was killed in the savage fighting, and Yano took over, leading one last suicidal push that was also utterly crushed by the Australian fire. At dawn, not a single Japanese soldier had successfully crossed to the other side of the airfield. Sensing the enemy's spirit was broken, Clowes then launched a relentless counterattack with the 2nd 12th Battalion in pursuit. They utilized a genius and innovative tactic, ranging their heavy artillery into the bay first to establish coordinates, and then using smoke shells to mark enemy positions with precision for the Kitty Hawks to strafe from the air. This coordinated, relentless pursuit completely broke the back of the Japanese resistance. In one particularly fierce battle, 60% of a 200-man Japanese company was wiped out in minutes. It was during this final phase, on the 4th of September, that Corporal John French of the 2nd 9th performed an act of supreme, legendary heroism that still echoes in military history. Facing 3 separate Japanese machine gun nests that were pinning his men down and causing heavy casualties, he single-handedly charged the positions with a submachine gun and grenades, destroying all 3 nests and silencing the guns forever. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his incredible bravery and self-sacrifice. By the night of the 5th of September, the Japanese High Command was forced to order a total and humiliating evacuation. The Japanese Navy was shocked to find over 930 survivors waiting on the beach, men who had chosen the shame of retreat over the glory of death, a sight almost unheard of for the Imperial Army in 1942. The Battle of Milne Bay was a total, unmitigated victory for the Allies. The invincible Japanese had been stopped dead in their tracks for the first time on land, proving to the world that the Australian soldier, even the humble and mocked militia, was a match for any elite force on the planet. This victory was the result of a perfectly coordinated effort between the infantry, the Air Force, the Navy, and the American engineers. This battle remains one of the most defining turning points of the Second World War, the moment where the Japanese advance was halted forever, turning the tide of the Pacific War and ensuring that the names of these brave men would live on for generations. These soldiers, initially viewed as second-class citizens by the elite, had become the saviors of their nation and the masters of the jungle.